Hello, and welcome to the 8th episode of the Tom Talks podcast with myself, Tom Randall. Today I talk with Dr. Adam Montgomery about his book, The Invisible Injured, Psychological Trauma in the Canadian Military from the First World War to Afghanistan. The Invisible Injured, published by McGill Queen's University Press and available on Amazon and Indigo, is the first book-length history of how war and peacekeeping trauma affected Canadian soldiers from 1914 to 2014. Our conversation ranges on many important topics that The Invisible Injured raises, including how psychological trauma has been interpreted and reinterpreted since the First World War in the Canadian context, and the role masculinity as a gender identity has played in identifying and diagnosing trauma in the military. Dr. Adam Montgomery is a historian of medicine and Canadian military history. His research uses history as a way to assess medical and cultural change over time, particularly with regard to society's view of mental health and illness. He aims to bring academic rigour to his research and publications while still writing for a public audience. The book of our discussion, The Invisible Injured, and Adam's first book, received an Amazon bestseller tag after its release in May 2017. Adam is also the co-author of the forthcoming book, After the War. You can follow Adam on Twitter at amontgomery82 and visit his website at adam-montgomery.ca. With that, I give you Adam. So with me is Adam Montgomery. Adam, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
So congratulations on your recent publication, The Invisible Injured. Before we get into the specifics of the book, I mean, there's so many great themes in there that I want to talk about, especially how we define trauma, the role of masculinity in the military in terms of how post-traumatic stress disorder is interpreted and has been interpreted, or trauma generally, over the timeline that you look at. I wondered, just to begin with, if you could elucidate on what drives your interest in this particular topic.
That's a good question. For me, it's a bit of personal and a bit of professional. So on the professional side, I'll start with, I've always had an interest in mental health and how mental health and illness have been interpreted historically and how changes to medicine, science, I guess public attitudes, culture, how all of these things affect how we view mental illness, how we view mental health, and how we treat people, and I guess how we approach them who are affected by mental illness. And so I've always also had a fascination in military history, and not the kind of old school guns and ammo histories, more the grandness of the events and the war and peacekeeping, any sort of military service. These operations, they tend to bring out these sort of grand events and grand personalities, and there's a lot going on. And so I've always been interested in how war and society interact with each other, how they produce and change our views of things. And in regards to mental illness, war has had in Canada, it's had a very stimulating effect on how we approach mental illness. So I cover, The Invisible Injured covers 100 years from the beginning of the First World War all the way through to the end of Canada's combat operations in Afghanistan. I chose that long time frame because I wanted to really see change over time. And looking at that, it allowed me to capture the First World War, the Second World War, little of the Korean War. There's sort of a gap between the Korean War and then the peacekeeping operations that Canada was involved in the sort of starting in the early 90s, the fall of the Soviet Union, and the sort of ethnic strife in various regions around the world. So by looking at such a long time frame and all these various operations, it allowed me to look at how our views of trauma have changed, how soldiers were treated during war and after war, how public attitudes, cultural attitudes affected things like pensions and how veterans were commemorated or seen by the public. So that's that. So that's the professional side. On the personal side, my grandfather was a World War II vet, like a lot of Canadians. So for me, I had an interest in his service when I was young, but I didn't quite understand it. You know, you only as a kid you interpret things through sort of a child's lens, and I didn't really understand the complexities of it. And as I got older, he passed away when I was 18, but subsequently, I was given some of his old war memorabilia, like inherited a belt that he had, a Nazi. It was an SS belt that he had taken, presumably from a German, I would imagine. So there are lots of that kind of on a personal level. As I got older, led me to really look and think more about the human side of his service and sort of what the war did to him as a person. And like many veterans of his generation, you know, from hearing from my grandmother, my mother, he had nightmares for the rest of his life after the war. Probably today would have been diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder. I'm not sure, but I think a lot of the symptoms are sort of what people would say now is classic PTSD symptoms. So it's sort of a combination of personal and professional, and they came together nicely. And you know, several years later, here I am.
Excellent. And one of the best things about this book is just how articulate it is. And when you're discussing this work over a 100-year period, I mean, my first thought would be just how daunting that amount of research would be. So I just wondered, how did you decide what to narrow down on, which particular research it was that you're going to use? I mean, so you use a lot of primary research for the latter part of the book, which we can get into. But in terms of the earlier part of the book, how did you decide which parts of research to focus on in terms of what newspaper articles there were, what professional academic journals there were at the time? How did you narrow it down?
As you mentioned, for the later period, I used a lot of oral interviews and government documents, things like that. So there was it was a little easier with the primary stuff for that period. In the earlier period, what I essentially had to do, I mean, the literature is so vast that I had to basically decide which parts I was going to focus on. And I wanted a Canadian focus. I wanted, as best as I could, have a national focus. So part of my choice was to have things like the Globe, or now the Globe and Mail. I chose that because that was a paper that was circulated in Ontario, later nationally. So in terms of newspapers, it was one of the few that would really allow you to say this is being, I guess, broadcast, so to speak, to a Canadian audience. So that was my rationale for that. And then for the medical journals, things like that, like the Canadian Medical Association Journal is great because it goes back through the whole time period that I was looking at. So I really had to find the publications that are long ranging and in some cases still excellent today. So that was my choice with those. And then I kind of decided from there, you know, you have to be selective because when you have a long study or like a long time frame you're looking at, it's very easy to get bogged down, and the book could be 1,000 pages easily. So I really just had to pick and choose the ones that allowed me to say this is a nationally circulated idea or discourse. Also, you know, not get into so much depth and into so many journals and newspapers that I ended up doing only that. So certainly for the earlier part of the book, I was very upfront about that in my introduction. I relied far more heavily on secondary literature written by historians because if I did the primary research for all of it, it could have easily been a 30-year project. Less had been written about the latter period from sort of post-Cold War to now. I wanted more primary stuff there because it was a story that hasn't been told and wasn't told yet. And for the earlier stuff, I thought, well, the literature on shell shock is vast, especially in Britain, some in the United States, and in Canada there's been a little bit. So I thought, well, you know, since a lot of that has been written, there's still a lot of interesting things to say about it, but I thought, well, let's put the primary research focus on the latter half of the book, and especially, again, going back to the personal, because of, you know, my grandfather's experiences and stuff, I thought, well, this is a great chance for me to interview still living veterans, younger veterans often. I think the oldest one was like 56 or 57, still living and still vivid memories of their experiences. And it really allowed me to get that living perspective that a lot of history books don't have. So that was sort of my general approach.
I suppose you could get some good insights as to their experiences and then almost transpose that onto maybe what experiences your grandfather had if you weren't able to have those conversations as well.
With the veterans, it's tricky because doing the oral interviews, it's inevitable at some point you start to, in a way, kind of identify with your subject because you're listening to them. They become human to you very quickly, as opposed to if you're reading about somebody in a book. And so the trick is to sort of to listen to their stories and to interpret them, but to still try to maintain as much of an objective eye as you can, because they're still human beings, and you still have to a degree measure what they're saying against the other evidence you've collected to say, well, how much does this experience fit with the other ones? How much can I generalize from this experience, or how much is this a particular idiosyncratic experience? So that there's that trick there, but certainly it does allow you to really think more about it. In my case, it allowed me to think more about grandfather's memories and just I guess really veterans as a whole. If you've never served, I've never served, and if you've never been in the military yourself, militaries all across the world, it's a very different culture, and they're a world unto themselves with their own culture, their own values. And some of this is taken from civilian society, and it's kind of a mirror of civilian society. Some of it is very, very different, and so speaking with veterans, it allows you kind of a peek into that world that you wouldn't have unless you were a soldier yourself. So,
How did you get in contact with those veterans for your primary research? Was it? I mean, you mentioned in the book that it had its own problems. I wonder if you could elucidate on that.
with the interviews, basically the way it started is I didn't really. I'll be honest. At first, I didn't know how to approach it because the military is a very closed culture, and so and especially when you're dealing with a subject like trauma, you can't just call people out of the blue and say, "Hey, I heard you were traumatized. Do you want to talk about it?" You have to really you have to approach it with a sensitive, a sensitive eye. So what I did is I started by emailing and calling some of the local legions, but then what I quickly found is that the legions, a lot of them tend to be frequented by the older generation of vets, which is good. But for me, wanting to look at the sort of latter period, the period from the post-Cold War on, I wasn't finding a lot of those vets at the legions because a lot of them now they're tech savvy and they're on the internet. They're posting on message boards about things. They chat that way. They post on social media, etc. So I was kind of fortunate. I called what's called a Military Family Resource Center, and the gentleman I spoke with said, well, your best bet is to contact OSIS. And I didn't know what OSIS was, but I learned it's the Operational Stress Injury Social Support Program. And they're a program that was set up it started in 2001 and kind of went live in 2002. And they were a program that was started to help veterans that were specifically dealing with what are now called operational stress injuries. So that can be anything from depression, post-traumatic stress, addictions, various things. So when he said that, I thought, okay, well, I have to learn more about this. So I did my research. I called, or actually I shouldn't say I called. I emailed the major who was in charge at that time, was the national coordinator, and just explained, here's the project I'm doing. I'm looking for people that I can speak with, and because it sort of worked out nicely that because of this program focuses specifically on operational stress injuries, to be a part of the program, you have to have had that. So for me, that then I was able to then think to myself, well, okay, this is perfect. This will get me in touch with exactly the kind of interviewees I need without me having to cold call and sort of, how else would you do it? You can't just sort of canvass 100 veterans and say, oh, which one of you has PTSD? Let me know. So this kind of allowed me a nice entry into that world without having to sort of be insensitive or approach it in a way that might offend people or that sort of thing.
one of the issues on top of that as well is how your gender identity, let's say how I'm supposed to act as a man, how that impacted veterans in terms of opening themselves up, expressing the issues that they've had, and really sort of holding back the sort of help that they deserved. So I wonder if we could elaborate on just how important this idea of masculinity is and how we define masculinity in the first place in this context.
Yeah, I mean, masculinity. It's funny. The project that when I started it, I didn't conceptualize it as a gender project or as a gender history project. It was to me it was a medical history first and then a military history second. But as time went on, I realized that I absolutely could not ignore the fact that masculinity pervades the whole culture. It always has, and to a degree, all of society too. And so I really, it was probably one of the most rewarding parts of doing the research was learning about about masculinity, about how it's constructed, why it's constructed a certain way. I mean, I never thought about these things when I was young myself. You just act the way you act. You don't realize how much culture plays a role in this. And so, but as I started doing the research, I realized, the same to a degree. Things have changed, and you can't say people now are better off. Soldiers are better off. I think men in general in Canada in 2017 are better off in terms of being allowed to express masculinity in several ways, different ways. Certainly better off than men were 100 years ago. But to a degree, some of these ideas haven't changed at all. So what I started noticing was, things like stigma about mental illness. We'll talk about the military because that's essentially what the book is about. But in the First World War, you were a soldier that was diagnosed with shell shock or what they call neurasthenia or various other things. After the war, pension questions were often decided when it came to shell shock. They were often decided the whether or not you deserved a pension in the eyes of pension officials and doctors that were examining or hearing your case was based to a large degree on sort of these masculine conceptions, these ideas of how much of a man were you in the war? Did you do your duty? And if you did, why are you still having problems? And in the culture of the time, it was this pull up your bootstraps culture. And it was no matter what you're facing, no matter what hardships you've had, pull yourself up and keep on going. And if you don't, it's not the war's fault, it's your fault. So you're less of a man, and there were all kinds of reasons. There were some medical, scientific, the whole idea of social Darwinism and degeneration, all kinds of ideas that were going on as well. But it really came down to, the war is over. It's been a year, 2 years, 5 years, whatever. Act like a man, get on with it, get back to work, get a job, and shut up and pay your bills, support your family, and keep going. And that was the attitude. And Second World War, things changed to a degree. They called it something different. They called it battle exhaustion, and after the war, they called it a neurosis or various other things. But still, the attitude in a lot of cases, and again, the attitude amongst the public and amongst doctors in a lot of cases about whether you were deserving of sympathy, of a pension, etc., it was, how much of a man have you been, or are you acting like a man, and are you facing this and moving on? And there was always this attitude of the war is over, time to move on. To a degree, that's still the same today. It's come a long way. Veterans of, say, Afghanistan, they are certainly there's a public discussion of mental health that just didn't exist 100 years ago, or even 50 years ago, or even 25 years ago. So certainly men can talk about it more. Female soldiers can talk about it more as well. But there's still in the military, because it's such a hyper masculine culture. It's a there are women in the ranks and a significant number of them, but it still is very much a macho masculine world where the attitude is weakness is not tolerated, and if you have something wrong with you, just grin and bear it and just keep going. And so There's more discussion, but certainly we're far from at a point where mental health is viewed in the same way as a broken leg in the military, where with the same level of sympathy, with the same level of understanding. And again, the world has changed since the First World War in a lot of ways, but masculine culture has bent, but it hasn't broken. And so you still have, to a large degree, this dominant conception of masculinity as being the strong, stoic man who bears all hardships stoically and moves on and doesn't cry, doesn't ask for help, and just moves on and sucks it up and gets on with life. And that's still, to a degree today, still affects people. And I heard that from some of the veterans I interviewed. In some cases, they waited 10 years before they got help, even though essentially, what they'd experienced had been ruining their life for 10 years. But in some cases, it was a lack of education. They just didn't know what it was. They weren't taught. And in other cases, they just didn't want to see because it went against these very deeply ingrained ideas of what a man and a soldier should be. And when their identity was so heavily invested in it, it was too scary to think of what it would be like to abandon that identity or to sort of ignore that identity to get help or to talk about.
And some of your research on it, I mean, one of the most fascinating parts of that in my own reading was just like how shocking that connection is in terms of something like what sorts of pensions should veteran soldiers get. So in chapter 5, I made a note of just in the 1990s, where still bureaucratic organizations were still almost stacked against the troops in terms of the soldiers could be diagnosed with or be medically discharged by the Canadian Armed Forces, but the definitions for why you can be medically discharged and the definitions given by the organisation that gave the pensions were different, and so you may be medically discharged for a psychological trauma, but then that same definition wasn't recognised by those that were given the pensions. And so the soldiers are almost caught in the middle of that. And then we could even go back to this gentleman that I hadn't heard of, Chisholm. I haven't got his first name written down, but I think during the Second World War, he became the first deputy Minister of Health. And one of the quotes that I wrote down, which just speaks to what you're saying brilliantly, was Chisholm: too many women are bringing up too many boys on female values, and that the trauma that many soldiers might experience isn't a result of the war itself, but on character defects and maybe an effeminate upbringing, and that young boys are not being raised as, quote, men anymore, and that was the reason for it.
Certainly, I mean, Brock Chisholm, he was a very interesting figure, very eccentric character, and had a lot of interesting. I put in some footnotes, sort of some of his more eccentric behaviors and ideas about what he thought. The thought that telling children that there was a Santa Claus was sort of a devastating thing to their psychological development. And he was a very interesting guy. But in terms of his views of the war, yeah, he was a reflection of a lot of the attitudes of the time, and it was this idea that, well, if men are having trouble, I should say first that the Second World War, because of the First World War being so collectively traumatic to the public and to Canada, it was small population and lots, 60,000 almost dead, and then many more wounded. It affected many Canadians. So there was an understanding by the Second World War, to a degree, that every soldier had their breaking point, but that attitude more still related to the war itself. If you're in combat long enough, or you're put on the front lines long enough, eventually you'll have your breaking point. So there was sympathy about that, but it's still, after the war, it was this attitude of, well, move on. And in terms of Brock Chisholm's ideas, he was a reflection of this idea that, well, we're just not preparing people well enough, not preparing men well enough. And his idea that we were bringing up boys on female values. That was sort of he was to a degree an adherent of Freudian theory. So he was always looking at things like libido and the connection between how much a man's interaction with his mother or coddling would affect his future development as a man and all those sorts of things. So there were certainly some Freudian ideas going on in his head, but generally speaking, it was also just still a pervasive attitude of what traditional masculinity was and what it should be. And so really it's it became this idea or this attitude that we understand if you're in combat you might have some problems, but when you get home you should be better. And after the war, this was these same ideologies, the same attitudes were then brought to bear on why soldiers might have what by that point they were calling a neurosis or various other things. And the idea was, well, we have to look now to his childhood development. We have to look at his relationship with his mother, with his father, and those kinds of things. And those are the reasons why those are the real traumas. And the war is just the memories of the war are just reactivating a trauma from earlier life, and so on.
Right, and so that explains some of the stigma attached to mental illness to veterans and soldiers still in action. And tied into all of this as well is how the military itself understands mental illness as maybe as a kind of weakness, or they don't want to expound the fact that their soldiers do get mental illnesses on the battlefield. Why is it in your research? Why is it that there is such a desire to keep this idea of mental illness constricted from the wider public view? So, I mean, this is something that you write about. It goes all the way from World War One of wanting to make sure that, I suppose, the enemy doesn't know about your soldiers suffering from it, but even up to the point where you end in 2001, there's still some culture that says that we don't want to openly express that the military is vulnerable to this. So why is there a desire to keep it hidden?
Yeah, part of that is what I think some have called the contagion effect. So that's certainly part of it, which is that there's always been this worry, and there still is, that to a degree, that if you talk about a problem enough, or if there's too much of a discussion or numbers are put around, that it will lead to a contagion effect where you'll have an increase in the number. And there's always this fear of fakers, malingerers. They've had all kinds of terms historically for them: fakers, malingerers, scrimshankers, all kinds of things. But essentially, that fear has always been there. And you get some of that discussion even today, because now post-traumatic stress disorder is being discussed in things like the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, in emergency medical workers, like ambulance workers, paramedics. So you really get you have an expanded discussion of PTSD now, and what that's done is, in some cases, led to people saying, well, there are a lot of people that are faking, and this can't be real, or most of these cases are fake, and that's always been a fear in the military, because of the fact that their primary concern is preserving manpower. It's easy to forget in quote unquote peacetime that our militaries are still essentially trained to go somewhere and make somebody do something that they don't want to do, whether it's peacekeeping and keeping warring parties apart, or whether it's going in, like in Afghanistan, and actually going and killing enemy combatants. So they're still trained. Even in 2017, their primary goal is to, when the government tells them to go somewhere and achieve a political objective, that's what they do. So their concern is having as many soldiers as possible ready for action at any time. And so that leads to this universality of service principle I discuss in the book, which is this idea that you should be operationally deployable at any time. And if you're not, then you're a liability. And that's where you really get the connection between mental illness and the military's fear of it. I don't think a lot of the leadership in the Canadian forces are, it's easy to think it's some conspiracy. It's not. The generals they're aware of what at this point of what PTSD is. They're aware of how war can mentally affect soldiers. I don't think it goes on at a conscious level, but it's military culture as a whole at a subconscious level. I'm not sure if subconscious is the right term, but at some level, military culture itself is looking to preserve manpower and to have a closed culture that is impervious to other influences. And mental illness attacks those things because it goes against it first, from a sort of pragmatic standpoint, it gives you fewer troops in the field. And then from an intellectual perspective, it challenges a lot of the military ethos because the military, in order to train people to go and do these things and see these horrible things, you have to ingrain in them a sort of toughness and stoicism. And so the big challenge, I think, today is sort of, and where we're at, and I think not just Canada, but the Western world, and I think a lot of militaries around the world, where we're at is now that we have this understanding of trauma, now that there's more of a discussion about it, more of a public sympathy towards it, and even an official sympathy towards it, where do you draw the line between, that sympathy and, the fact that the military, if we want to continue to have them, still has to be operationally ready if the government needs them or wants them for something. And that's where I think we're going to be dealing with that question for a long time. I mean, that's what we have been dealing with we have been dealing with it for as long as warfare has existed, but it wasn't really until, the sort of last 100 years with professional medicine and mass media and all these discussions and science, all of these things coming together, that we now have we've reached this point where we're now saying, we understand the problem, but how do we get around it? And I think that's going to continue to haunt us for a long time. Essentially, whether it's war, peacekeeping operations oftentimes are not peaceful, and soldiers see awful things, traumatic things. So how are we to bring them back, help them reintegrate, help them overcome any sort of issues that they have from service, and at the same time, still have the military do what it needs to do, and that's the big challenge.
One of the most interesting chapters for me, something that I hadn't really thought about in the Canadian context, which you bring to light, is not just what goes on in the warfare, but what goes on during peacekeeping missions as well. So Canada, for a long time after the Second World War, I suppose, wanted to have this perception as a peacekeeping nation. And I think you say it became ingrained into the national psyche that Canada's a world player in trying to keep the peace going and performing various kinds of United Nations missions. But some of the stories that you recount in, I think it's chapter 4, were just astonishing. So some of the way some soldiers acted in Somalia. It's amazing that it's not just the war, the actual war itself, but trying to maintain peace itself comes with this risk of psychological trauma.
Yeah, I think what makes the Canadian case unique, or at least somewhat unique, certainly there are other peacekeeping countries and countries that pride themselves on it, so I don't want to push the argument too far and make it sound like we're the only ones that have ever done it. But in the Canadian context, I think partially what makes our historical experience unique is that because from sort of the 1950s onward, so much of our national identity has been tied up in projecting ourselves as this middle power sort of peacekeeping nation. It really affected how we viewed the missions themselves. And so in the late 80s, early 90s, particularly in the 90s, when you have all of this ethnic strife around the world, in the former Yugoslavia especially, Rwanda is another great example, you have peacekeepers thrown into these missions that are not by any stretch of the imagination a peaceful situation, but the public's perception, and to a degree the military's, because they hadn't seen, by the time these missions came around, they hadn't seen things like that in quite some time. So this perception that they were going to be going and sort of standing there, pridefully standing there handing candy to children, or that they would be sort of standing between two warring parties with their arms out, keeping them apart and playing the sort of proud Canadian peacekeeper. That wasn't at all what they were dealing with on the ground. So really, you have a situation where soldiers are and I recount some of them in the book, and I didn't even use half of the stories because I was told, because I just didn't want to have too many graphic things in there. But they things like seeing dead infants, bodies dragged in along the side of the road, decapitated heads in buckets, and things like that. This is not at all what a lot of them were expecting, or what they thought that they would be doing. And in some cases, they were forced to watch a lot of things happening around them, and their mandate, their UN mandate, or their NATO, whatever it was, the rules of engagement did not allow them to actually act on some of the things that they saw happening. So this really caused a lot of problems, and mentally, and after, and a lot of them still live with it to this day. And that was a shock to the Canadian public to a degree, because it wasn't what people expected. They thought, as the name implies, peacekeeping, that it was sort of keeping peace, and that it was, again, that sort of traditional view of standing there handing candy out, or just preventing people from arguing with one another. And the reality of it was they were in war zones, and they were in the middle of a war zone, and in some cases, in a lot of cases, weren't actually able to do anything about it. So it really, that's part of, I think, what brought PTSD and discussions of mental illness into the sort of Canadian national discourse, because with so many of these operations happening by the late 90s, and certainly by the time of Afghanistan, there are enough soldiers coming back now who are affected that eventually the military and the public had to sort of admit the fact that this wasn't at all what they thought was going to be happening, and it wasn't at all the sort of consequence that they expected.
So we should probably address the elephant in the room in regards to this. We've skirted around it a bit, but we should absolutely talk about the way that trauma has been defined over the period of time that you look at. So if I get the general thesis right, or at least one of them that you present, that trauma, or you talk about post-traumatic stress disorder, is another representation of trauma as a continuing cultural and medical project that aims to bring trauma's numerous social and health effects under a wealthy encapsulated umbrella. It's a very interesting way to look at trauma, because when we say trauma, we tend to think of, it's obvious there's negative connotations to it. But when it comes down to it specifically, what counts as it? What are the manifestations of it, psychologically, physiologically? If it's so difficult to pin down what it is it ever possible to actually fully define what it is? Are we getting closer to a definition, or is it just a cultural phenomenon in terms of how we keep on reinterpreting this problem? And there's some great literature that you refer to that's on my next to read list. I've got down two major ones would be Alan Young's The Harmony of Illusions and Edward Shorter's From Paralysis to Fatigue. They look like brilliant books to read. So we need to talk about the role the psychiatrists have played throughout this 100-year period in terms of defining what trauma is. So maybe we can start off at the beginning of the book. What was the role of the psychiatrists during this time, during the First World War?
Because conceptually, the First World War, they didn't have much of a role, because it wasn't really until sort of the middle to the latter part of the war that they actually were brought in. You had, for the most part, what was called shell shock was really dealt with by the medical officers, who had any, in some cases were medically, had an MD, and in other cases were just given a course and then sent on their way. So it really was dealt with by the medical officers on the ground for the most part. As you have organized hospitals developing towards the end of the war, you then start to see a more organized approach where psychiatrists are playing a role in the treatment and things like that. But really, the definition and the understanding at the time was very idiosyncratic, and what one doctor would call a shell shock, another might call something completely different. And the terminology was a reflection. The reason I think that shell shock, one of the reasons that it has took on such a sort of resonance had such resonance with the public and still is something that comes up in popular parlance today, is that it really captured the traumatic effects of the war in a nice general way that allowed people to think that they understood what it meant. And in the Second World War, they sort of called the similar phenomenon battle exhaustion, because there were reasons for that I won't fully go into because it would take us too far afield. But essentially, over this whole period, and even today, I think if you look at it philosophically, your trauma brings us to the sort of limits of language and the current limits of psychiatry to objectively define and assess what is essentially a subjective condition. And what I mean by that is, first of all, a lot of what is considered traumatic is a very subjective thing in and of itself. If you're a police officer, depending on where, let's say in a big city, you will probably be seeing what most people would consider traumatic things on a semi-regular basis. And again, it depends on where, but certainly in a big city, if you had, say, a high murder rate or things like sexual assault, things like that, where you're constantly, your moral view of the world is constantly being threatened by what you're seeing and having to stop and do, that would affect you. That, to a civilian, someone who's never been a police officer or a soldier, those kind of things would be that much more traumatic. To a police officer, they may or may not be, because the police officer to some degree has been trained, or the soldier has been trained to deal with these kind of events, to expect them. It's sort of more part of their daily life and routine. Same with a paramedic, where they might be dealing with death on a regular or semi-regular basis. As civilians, how often do we ever, aside from going to funerals, we don't really deal with death. It's its own industry now. It's sort of pushed off to the side. But this idea of trauma, or what our understanding of it is essentially a subjective thing. And so when we're trying to come up, or when, let's say psychiatry is trying to come up with, well, how do we define post-traumatic stress disorder? Well, what they've done is they've done various studies and interviews, and then correlated various studies, and then they've said, well, what are some of the most common symptoms? Things like flashbacks and things like hypervigilance and irritability and all kinds, these common symptoms. And they've taken them, they've put them into this sort of framework and said, this is what post-traumatic stress disorder is. And these are the criteria you need to have in order to be diagnosed with it. Well, that's all fine and good. But the problem is that you have all kinds of events and all kinds of things that happen to human beings throughout their lives. And certainly, obviously, and if you're a soldier and you're in a war zone, these things are going to happen much more frequently. But why are some people able to bear it and others not? Things like questions like that, we're really still just scratching the surface of. Some soldiers went to Afghanistan 3-4 tours, came back fine. Others went for one, 6 or 9 month tour, came back post-traumatic stress disorder, and even sometimes similar experiences, but one soldier comes home fine and the other isn't. And it really gets into a lot of our physical understanding of the brain is still very rudimentary in terms of trauma. So doctors can't really necessarily say why one person will be traumatized to the point where it'll be a debilitating condition and why somebody else isn't. And then in terms of language, a lot of psychiatry is still talking to the patient, asking them, how are you feeling? Explain what is troubling you. And how people choose to report that, they're working on the language that, the sort of terms and language that they understand and they've been taught to use in these kinds of situations. And it's not always going to be the same person to person. And essentially, when you get into these very big, very grand or events, or especially traumatic events, how, sometimes words, we were just at a loss for words and how to describe it. And at that point, it's sort of like, how does psychiatry get around that? How do we, and the mission or the strategy so far has been to try and objectively attack the problem as much as possible. But essentially, when you're dealing with human beings, it's not so easy to fit them into these boxes, and that's partly why now you have, with these increased discussions about PTSD in different contexts, you have people now wondering, where has this term gone? Has it gone too far? Does it really explain it? Should we, add this criterion? Should we take it out? Should we do this? Should we do that? And really, psychiatrists, I don't want to denigrate their work because they're doing their best. But at the end of the day, you read enough of the studies, you realize that really nobody really does fully understand what's going on. We're poking around in the dark to a certain degree, and that's why I think it's a subject that will continue to be discussed, and why partly I think why it has captured the public imagination in the last 10 years, especially because we'd like to think that we have a lot of our problems solved now, but it's not the same. Approaching trauma and post-traumatic stress disorder is not the same as approaching a physical ailment like surgery or something of that nature, where it's like, here's oncology, here's the cancer, we're going to take it out, and we're going to do this, and hopefully you're fine, or and you're on the road to recovery. It's not the same with trauma because there's so many other things going on, and social things that are, we're only really starting to understand the social elements of it, and how much things like support, like peer support, family support, these kinds of social factors, how much of a role they play, and why some soldiers or other individuals that have PTSD are able to recover, and why others we're still just scratching the surface of the subject. And what I really hope that my book does more than anything else is get that discussion going more in Canada with historians, with political scientists, and with the public, so that people can start to look at it from a understanding that I think history brings to the table. How much have things changed over time, and why have they changed, and what are the reasons, what are the agents behind this change? That really, to me, is one of the most crucial things when you're discussing a subject like this that has been around for such a long time, but hasn't really been in the public eye until very recently.
So if this podcast episode is testament to anything, it's the service that your book's done. I mean, I hadn't read much about this topic before, and having read it, I have to say I want to read more about it, especially the literature that you mentioned throughout the book. This all just seems so interesting, and something that it hasn't been at the forefront of my mind. So I really appreciate the work that you've done here. The other thing I was going to add is to expand on the social reasons for trauma. So it's not just for the psychological issues with the person, and it's not just the traumatic effects of war, but also when some soldiers return home. I think especially after the Vietnam War, you mentioned that there was a certain public stigma in Canada for certain soldiers because, well, I don't think any Canadians went to Vietnam, did they? But there was a stigma that returning soldiers, we'll say in the US, there was a public denigration of them in terms of calling them various names, focusing a lot on the various kinds of, I suppose you could call it, like war crimes, like the raping, the murdering of various Vietnamese villages and so on. And so that lasting social, it's not like you leave Vietnam and you leave the war behind. You have constant reminders around you all the time as well. And you're a focus of it as well. As a soldier, you could be stigmatized in that. So the other thing I was going to ask as well is, does psychiatry have a dark almost like there was a point in its history that seemed to be quite unflattering, I'll say. And so this might add to the complexity of pinning down how the field of psychiatry defines trauma. And that I think, especially after the Second World War, there was an interest of various psychiatrists to define this in various ways that kept their job going. Were there elements there where there was a personal interest of various psychiatrists and maybe even higher up military personnel for how they defined these psychological traumas?
Yeah, I mean, certainly you have, and again, not to denigrate psychiatrists, but like any profession, they have vested interests, and they're like any or other professionalized organization, the American Psychiatric Association is a big organization, very influential, wields a lot of clout, and so what they choose to do and how they choose to define things, it really does either create industries or get rid of industries. And certainly when it comes to trauma, you have a situation where as psychiatry expands, as there are more psychiatrists in private practice, in hospitals, obviously in psychiatric hospitals, and as they're talking more about trauma, and eventually in 1980 defining it and defining PTSD and basically enshrining it in their manual, it creates a situation where trauma does sort of take on a life of its own. And so, and again, this is where we're at today, where there's been a lot of criticisms. So a lot, and in fairness, a lot of them have come from within the American Psychiatric Association itself, saying this: what are we doing here? This definition has gotten bigger, and we've changed it. And what is really going on here? What are we doing here? And an industry has developed around it to a certain degree, and in some cases, like in certain legal areas, you have some very unscrupulous things going on with the way personal injury attorneys and things like people like that. Some of them are using trauma. They're really wanting to really push it as much as possible and expand, and because it benefits them financially when they can bring to a case the fact that their client has post-traumatic stress disorder because of whatever happened, and in some cases perfectly justified, obviously. In others, you can certainly see a rise publicly in the way that since psychiatry has decided to give it attention and basically give it a definition that the public can Google and look up themselves, it has created a sort of industry in a way that in some cases now a lot of people are seeing, and even PTSD sufferers themselves, a lot of them are saying, no, this is what's going on here. We've gone too far, or I guess just asking the question, where are we going with this? Because from a period there from the 1980 until sort of very recently, it really wasn't. You don't really, when you read the historical literature, or when you read the studies throughout that period, you don't really get a sense that too many people had a strategy or a goal in mind. It was just sort of, let's just keep talking about it and keep doing more studies about it and keep expanding without actually really trying to say what the end point was, or acknowledging how much some of these other factors play a role, like social factors and things like that. And now you're starting to see, I think, more acknowledgement of that now that you are getting more of a patient-centered approach to medicine in general, where you're talking about things like peer support and family support and things like that.
I suppose this might be a bit of a paradoxical question to ask you as a historian, but do you see the future moving in directions that you think are beneficial towards overcoming these, well, the stigmas behind mental illness in the military, but also how we go about defining trauma and PTSD itself?
Yeah, I mean, certainly we've certainly come a long way in terms of the public understanding and sympathy towards it. So it's not necessarily a bad thing for somebody who is traumatized now to come forward and talk about it. And even amongst soldiers, there's a discussion of it that just didn't exist even 10 years ago. So certainly we have come a long way, but I think looking at the patterns that I found in my research and sort of where my research ended, sort of going to about 2014, 2015, one of the biggest challenges I think that's still with us is stigma and how we approach that, because there's a lot of talk about it now. There's a lot of talk of, every year we have these, Bell Canada has the Let's Talk campaign, and there's suddenly, for about a week every year or two, there's this big public interest in talking about mental health and mental illness. But really, whether it's within the military or civilian culture, mental illness is still something that generally the first reaction people have is fear, followed by sort of a shunning of it, and really, it's sort of people are happy to talk about it, but not really happy to experience it and deal with it, on the streets or with a family member or a friend or whatever it is. So, we've gotten to the point of the discussion, and that's very important. But it's sort of, will there ever be a point where people are willing to talk openly about mental health or mental illness when it affects them, sort of as it happens, or is there always going to be a sort of waiting period because people are worried about what others might think about it? And why I think trauma is so interesting, as opposed to, say, a disease like schizophrenia, where we now know the sort of a lot of the physical nature of it, and we can sort of, to even some degree, predict it. What the difference about trauma is that what makes it unique is that it happens from without, but that affects you within. So something happens to you, whether it's you almost die in a fire or a car accident, whatever it is, or if you're a soldier, obviously, any number of things. Something happens from outside of you and penetrates into your psyche, into your brain, and then things start happening within. And then from there, you can either, some people recover perfectly fine after, and for others it becomes completely debilitating. But the fact that it comes from without is part of what makes it such a unique phenomenon, because it's something where it can sort of strike anybody basically at any time. I mean, human beings are always in situations throughout their lives where they might do or deal with a situation that can cause these kinds of problems. And we, as I said, we've started talking about it, but I think a lot of it still ends with the talking. There hasn't been too much moving forward in terms of, okay, now that we've figured out what it is, now that we know what stigma, and now we've addressed what stigma is and the fear is, how do we get around it? And certainly the fact that, at least in Canada, mental health costs continue to go up every year, it seems to suggest that the current approach has sort of reached an end point, or at least we're at the point where we need to start figuring out something different. And as a historian, I don't know what the new approach should be or would be. But I think we've talked, and now we're sort of reached a point where it needs to go further.
Brilliant. Well, this has been a fantastic and enlightening conversation. I wish you the very best with your book, The Invisible Injured. You've got a few events coming up. Perhaps you'd like to say what those are for people who want to continue this conversation, maybe meet you in person as well.
Well, I do have, if people are within the Greater Toronto area, or then I'm actually in the Niagara region, so if they're in the Niagara region, I have a talk coming up October 25th at St. Catherine's Public Library, where I'll be talking more about the book and signing copies of it. I also have another event in November that will be in Thunder Bay, but that's more of a symposium, and it's more for academics, so I won't really plug that one. But yeah, that's pretty much it for now. I have another co-authored book coming out in February of 2018, so relatively soon. That's where I've sort of taken a bit of a backseat, but I've helped write the autobiography of a soldier, actually, who is discussed in The Invisible Injured, Stéphane Grenier. He was a peacekeeper in Rwanda, and he wanted to tell his story, and it's a very fascinating one. And so I helped him to get that together, and that'll be out in February 2018. So I'm excited about that, and that's pretty much what's on the horizon for now.
Oh, fantastic! I mean, it sounds like you got a lot going on, which is excellent. Grenier, if I just remember, he comes, or at least derives the term operational stress injury. Is that right?
Mm-hmm, yeah, right. He was the one that coined the operational stress injury term. So he's he now works in the civilian realm. He's trying to bring different approaches to mental health in the workplace, and trying to now bring some of what he learned in the military about stigma, about cultural change and things like that, and now he's brought that to the civilian world. So the book is sort of his whole story from when he first became a soldier, and then his experiences in Rwanda, and then all the way through to basically present day, and his work now in the civilian realm, trying to bring some of the changes. And I think as a former soldier, retired soldier, part of the advantage that the military approach can have in the civilian world is that it's a very action-oriented culture, and so he's bringing a lot of this action-oriented approach to the civilian realm, and I think doing a lot of good. And yeah, if people are interested in it, they'll have to buy the book. So.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a good plug in and of itself, just there. So, if people who want to follow you online, do you have any social media platforms like a website or Twitter?
Yeah, I do. My website is it's www.adam-montgomery.ca, and I'm on Twitter at amontgomery82.
Perfect. Well, thanks so much. Great conversation.
Yeah, thanks a lot for having me. Really appreciate it.
To keep up to date with the Tom Talks podcast, subscribe on iTunes and YouTube, and visit thomaserandall.ca. For more of Adam, you can follow him on Twitter at amontgomery82 and visit his website at adam-montgomery.ca. My thanks to Adam for joining me for this podcast, and thanks to you, the listener, for your support.